The 1950s, the suburbs of America. He returns home from work at 5 p.m., hangs his hat, and dinner is ready. She is dressed to impress, heels on with every household chore done. The children have every toy they could want in a beautiful family home with a pristine Chevrolet parked in the drive. Yet underneath this picture-perfect image lies a sad story of a desert life extinguished by consistent domestic violence, and a victim with nowhere to run. Some circles have consistently championed the economic prosperity of the 1950s in America as a time of moral virtue. Following the war, the USA as a victor and world leader brought in an era of consumerism, conformity, and nuclear family, all profligated by rampant advertising. Women were placed in a subordinate role, where bearing children was the only considered avenue for sexuality. However, underneath this veneer of conformity and family values was a cultural psyche fearful and anxious about sexuality and its freedoms. Ethnic and sexual minorities faced persecution. Unmarried was considered a scandal, and censorship kept any other thinking at bay. For all its nostalgic celebration, the 1950s was a time of great repression, and sexuality was its prime adversary. Join us today as we explore the contradictions and myths of 1950s politics and the winds of change they would foster. The 1950s has been mythologized in conservative circles as a time of higher morals and greater societal prosperity. It was a post-war world led by the U.S. The United States was in an economic boom period, and prosperity in American life was advertised and structured around rigid roles and family structures. The American dream was a life on rails: attain a home, a car, and a family of ideally 3 to 4 children. The man of the house goes out to work to provide. The woman of the house was expected to stay home, take care of the children, and maintain the homestead. This era of conformity and rigidity had a severe underbelly, though, and much of its rigidity was rooted in an underlying desire to control. For all its conformity and glamorization of marriage, the politics of the era could be described as a horror story. It was nearly expected a husband in the 1950s would cheat on his wife, and societally, domestic abuse could be characterized as disciplining and a husband's right. To compound this, divorcees in this era were shunned, and victims were typically blamed for calling abuse. As for sexuality, the family structure was a thin veneer for a society seemingly terrified of chaos. Psychiatrists of the era were alarmed that sexual morality breaking down meant the social fabric would inevitably follow. Sexual deviance, essentially any sexual practice that took place outside of a marriage, became something of a social obsession and a sign of weak morals. Across this decade, it would also be characterized as a potential into the threats of communism. Yet, this was all a myth. The reality was far more layered. Deviant behavior, as it was characterized, had been practiced by Americans for decades. A 1920s survey revealed over half of college-age young women had engaged in premarital. Come the 1950s, America had been through the Great Depression, followed by wartime, and despite the enforced conformity, there was an inherent desire to enjoy life, live for the moment. Come the mid to late 1950s, STIs, teenage mothers, and children born out of wedlock were all on the rise. Gonorrhea, for example, was believed to have been virtually extinct by the advent of antibiotics. Come the 1960s, it was back to levels found 2 decades prior. Media influence versus actual practices. Come the 1950s, television was the #1 outlet for culturing and shaping public opinion. American families would watch shows like The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver, in which suited husbands would return from work at 5 to be served dinner, and wives wore heels to do housework, while the children were always charmingly mischievous. This was far from the reality most people faced, and certainly was one they would struggle to fulfill. The heteronormative landscape of the time has been retrospectively debunked. Continually, the lives of married couples in the 1950s were rife with sexual incompatibility. At the time, this was declared frigidity on behalf of the wives. In retrospect, it has come to be seen that domestic violence was the likely harbinger of these unhappy physical relationships. Taboos, threats, and marginalization. Outside of the heteronormative tradition, the 1950s were an entirely persecutory time for one's sexuality. The DSM in 1952 declared homosexuality as a mental illness, and it would be over a decade and a half later that it was downgraded to a deviation. Homosexuality was viewed as some kind of arch nemesis to the vision of the American nuclear family. To be someone identifying as homosexual in the 1950s was a matter of taking your safety and life into your own hands. The Lavender Scare of the 1950s ran alongside the Red Scare and caused a giant moral panic in the United States over homosexuality. In the eyes of the 1950s, gay people were easier targets for manipulation and could put the entire country at risk of communism. Figure that one out. Come March of 1952, President Eisenhower would ban any LGBTQ+ persons from government employment, with 162 civil servants losing their jobs. Surveillance and blackmail were consistently used against such people. Unfortunately, it was not only the expression of sexual minorities that were persecuted in this era, but also ethnic minorities. The United States would only declare the segregation of public schools unconstitutional in 1954, and this was a world shaped by decades of Jim Crow laws. It should come as no surprise that interracial relationships were the making of pariahs and a threat to the safety of those in them. Laws across dozens of states outlawed socializing, dating, and marriage across the races at this time. Infamously, Richard and Mildred Loving would be jailed and fined before being exiled from Virginia for tying the knot in 1958. This was a time where profound bigotry and prejudice had shaped the nation. Asian Americans, African Americans, and Latin Americans were considered wild, undomesticated, and unstable. Literature, popular culture, and its impact. There would be no greater impact on sexual attitudes and behavior in literature and science than the work of Alfred Kinsey. From 1948 to 1953, Kinsey conducted reviews and research at the University of Indiana under the Institute for Research that he founded. The Kinsey reports were mind-bending to the 1950s cultural psyche. While Kinsey's work and methodology have received retrospective correction and evaluation, his foray into the taboo realm of practice broke ground at the time. His reports concluded nearly half of all married men had shared beds with other women, and near 70% of white American males had seen sex workers, and homosexual experiences were around the 40% mark. Kinsey's work had a profound effect on bringing sexuality away from the orthodoxy of psychiatry and the dogma of religious teaching. He has also been retrospectively praised as a leader in shining a light on LGBTQ+ identity at a time when society was persecuting it. In popular culture, no publication threw caution to the wind the way Playboy magazine did. Long before it was a very old dude in a robe surrounded by 20-somethings in a mansion, the Playboy magazine was a countercultural document of its day. Hugh Hefner started the publication in 1953, when the conservatism around sexuality was at a high point. A potentially strange thought to today's perspective, but Playboy magazine was once a social, political document full of writings on the civil rights movement, censorship, LGBTQ rights, and the First Amendment. Without a doubt, its most impactful asset was its advocacy of a socially liberal lifestyle and its charged front covers. Its first issue in December 1953 would have Marilyn Monroe cementing her status as a symbol on the rise to stardom. A publication demanding individual freedom in a time of rigid conformity and a pro-publication in a repressive era. Playboy magazine was an iconoclast in the 1950s. Sexual attitudes and behaviors would be challenged in the era globally through cinema. Across regions and cultures beyond the United States, namely Scandinavia, films would be used to explore sexual liberation. The conservative international standards of censorship would be challenged in the films of Ingmar Bergman and Vilgot Holman. Films of 1951 including She Danced One Summer and The Summer with Monica would display nudity and result in international uproar. The United States claimed the films were degrading to standards of decency. Not only would these films contribute to the idea of Swedish sin and Northern Europeans being salacious in their attitudes towards sexuality, but they would also contribute to progressing the public sensibilities towards matters of women's role, birth control, and the coming liberation. Across the decade, women were largely confined to subordinate roles in a rigid gender setup. However, this wasn't all that was happening. The seeds of women's movements can be found across the 1950s. Towards the close of the decade, specific publications for women could be found on magazine stands with the arrival of girly magazines. Though this is not to forget, this was a whitewashed decade in mass media, and the abundance advertised and promoted simply was not a reality for the average African American woman. Yet along with the arrival of commercially available cars in a prosperous society where most could afford them, young people were able to get out more than ever before. Lo and behold, a car to drive off in the attention of parents could be escaped, and premarital was on the rise in the 1950s America. It should also be said, this was a foundational decade for family planning and birth control. In the 1950s, Gregory Pincus and John Rock were funded by Planned Parenthood to develop the first birth control pills. While these would be available to the public in the following decade, it was in the 1950s when young people were able to travel of their own accord like never before. Colleges started promoting the use of contraceptives and birth control. Yet it was this post-war backlash that would prompt the coming second wave of feminism, where their efforts and sweat were something the war could not have been won without. Once the war was won, domesticity was a societal goal, and all of a sudden linked to patriotism and national security. Yet a revolution was coming, and that was just a snap of the fingers away relatively. Soon, reproductive rights, family, and the workplace were all under re-examination in the name of equality. Society and its views would never be the same. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.